Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to show you steps 16 through 21, meaning that we are going to finish the bag in this video. At the beginning of this step, you should have a tube that is your bag. So you should be able to stick your arm all the way through it and you should be able to see a hole. That means that your sides are sewn together. Before you begin, you should also have two flaps at the top of either side of the bag, and you should be able to scrunch it. If all of those things are true of your bag, you're ready to move on to the next step. So what we're going to do first is we're going to pin our webbing out of the way because we need to close this flap up here so that way it stays together. So what we're going to do is we are going to push our webbing all the way down and we're going to pin it out of the way. So we're going to hold this, pin that right there. So now the top of our bag has the webbing pulled out of the way. We're now going to do that on the other side as well. So we're pushing our webbing down as far as it'll go, and we're pinning it out of the way. So just like this, it doesn't need to be perfect because this is more of a placeholder than anything else. So now what we're going to do on both sides of the top of the bag, we're going to sew about a 1/2 inch up here, and we're going to sew a 1/2 inch up here as well. I'm going to show you a little trick. I'm going to put an extra pin right about where we should stop sewing, so that way you don't accidentally sew your webbing. So we've pinned the webbing out of the way, and now we're just going to sew from about here for a 1/2 inch, and we're going to go up, down, up, down, up on that side. We're doing the same thing on this side. The reason we're adding the second pin is so that way you don't accidentally sew your webbing, because if you sew your webbing, you're not going to be able to close your bag. And this gives you a good visual cue of where you should stop sewing. So now that I've pinned both sides, it should look like this. I shouldn't be able to scrunch my bag because the pins are holding it in place. And the next shot, I'm going to show you how to sew this. Okay, now that I have my pins in place right here, my webbing is pinned out of the way, and I have a marking for where I need to stop sewing. I am going to put it in the machine. Your strap should be on the inside part of the machine, and the rest of the bag fabric should be laying on the counter. I'm going to remove this pin because it's going to be easy for me to feel where the webbing is, but you definitely want to make sure if you need to poke your fingers through these holes to make sure that the webbing's out of the way, you can totally do so. But all we're doing is we're starting at the very top of the bag, and we're going to sew forward, back stitch, forward, and back stitch. That's all we're doing, and that's to make sure that we're closing the flap so that way the bag doesn't fall apart when we go to open it. So we're sewing forward, and we're sewing backwards, and then we're sewing forward, and that's it. You have to be extremely careful not to sew your webbing. So it should look like this when you're done. See how it's only a few stitches? But if I take out this pin, this doesn't come apart. I no longer have flaps because they're attached together. You only need to do about a 1/2 inch. You could theoretically go a little bit longer than this, but you want to make sure to keep it shorter rather than longer so that way you don't accidentally sew down your webbing. So now I'm going to flip my bag over so that way we can see the other side. Again, this time I'm going to leave the pin in so that way you can see where I need to stop sewing. So I'm going to start all the way up at the top, and then I'm going to sew forward for 3 or 4 stitches, and then I'm going to sew backwards and then sew forward. Now I'm going to remove this pin because now I know where I need to stop. And now I'm reversing and back stitching, sewing forward, and that's it. I now am going to trim off my loose threads, but this is what your finished product should look like. Should look like that on the other side as well. Trim off all your loose threads as you go so that way your bag looks nice and neat. But at the end of this step, you should still be able to scrunch it. So you can check to see if you've done it correctly by scrunching your bag. If it scrunches, that means you've done it correctly. If you cannot scrunch it like this, that means that you've done something wrong and you need to grab a seam ripper. In the next step, I'm going to show you how to pin your straps to the bottom and then sew the bottom of the bag. Okay, so now your bag should look like this. Your next step is to thread your strap through this hole that you've just now created. So you should be able to tuck your strap through there, pull it tight, make sure it's not twisted anywhere, anything like that. And now you're doing the same thing on the other side. So you're sticking your strap through this hole right here, threading it through, and then you should ideally see your two straps sticking out the bottom. So it's kind of hard to see on my demo, but you should see two straps sticking out the bottom. If they're not perfectly even, that's okay. It doesn't really matter, but if they are even, that's even better. What you want to make sure after you've threaded them is that they lay flat in the bag. So reach through to make sure that they're laying flat and that there's no twists. So that side is fine. Now I'm feeling to make sure that there's no twists in this side. And that side's fine as well. So again, they need to lay flat. So this side lays flat, this side also lays flat. So now I'm going to show you how to pin the bottom. And the very first pin that you're going to pin in place is the strap down here. You want your strap to be pinned in place completely flat. And then same thing with the other strap. You want it to be about equal distance from either edge. So maybe pin them about 1 inch in, and then you're going to pin them together. So now you can see where my pins are. My pins are holding my straps in place so I can't move them. Next, I'm going to pin a few more pins toward the bottom to make sure that everything lays flat and stays together. Like that. Maybe move this over a little bit. And now everything stays together. This is how we're closing the bag. So notice when I go to open my bag now, there's no more tube. You can't see through the other side because we've closed it down. So in the next shot, I'm going to show you how to sew this. Okay, so your first step is going to be to place your bag in the machine so it's ready to sew. You're going to start from the very edge over here, and you're going to sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I've lined up this edge of my fabric with the edge of the presser foot. If one of your sides is slightly shorter than the other, line up the presser foot with the shorter fabric so that way you don't accidentally sew holes in the bottom of your bag. Both of my pieces of fabric are even, so I don't need to worry about that. Next, I am going to sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance just like we've always done. I'm going to sew forward a bit, and then I'm going to backstitch and sew forward. Now that I'm coming up to where my first sewing clip is, this just happens to be where my strap is as well. I'm going to hold my strap down so that way it doesn't move. I'm going to sew forward at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. But then once I've completely cleared where my strap is, meaning I've completely sewn over the strap, I'm going to backstitch over the strap so that way it stays strong. And then I'm going to sew forward one more time. Now I'm going all the way to the end. I'm going to zoom in so that way you can see this a little bit better. Okay, so now I'm going to continue sewing forward. Now that I'm coming up to my next pin, I'm going to go ahead and remove it. Again, we're just doing one straight stitch all the way across at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to remove my clips as I come to them. Right here is a perfect example of where one of my sheets of fabric is a little bit longer than the other. So, because that's the case, I'm lining up my presser foot with the shorter fabric to ensure that I still sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance and that there are no holes in my bag. So I'm going to continue to sew straight across at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, removing my clips as I come to them. Now, this is another clip where my strap is attached, so I'm going to remove that but hold my strap in place. I'm going to sew completely over the strap at a 1/4 inch seam allowance as best I can. And then I'm going to back stitch over that entire strap and then sew forward again. You may notice that my stitching wasn't perfectly straight. That's okay if you mess up a little bit along the way, but you want to make sure that your stitching is as straight as possible. So now I'm going to sew forward all the way to the end and back stitch just like normal. And now I'm going to take it out of the machine and trim off my loose threads. I'm skipping the trimming the loose threads portion just so that way I can show you in one video what I would like you to do. So next, you're going to place your fabric in the machine just like you did initially, but instead, we are going to sew a zigzag stitch. I'm going to zoom out so that way you can see how I make the machine do a zigzag stitch. Okay, so in order to make sure that your machine does a zigzag stitch, you're going to look at the computer screen. Right now it says a number 1 because that's what we've been using the entire time so far. Instead, to make a zigzag stitch, we're going to press the number 2 right here and see how the number 2 changes on the machine. That means that we're going to do a zigzag stitch. Now I'm going to zoom you in a little bit more so that way you can see exactly how to sew the zigzag stitch. Okay, so now that we've changed the setting on our machine to make a zigzag stitch, we're going to sew forward just as we would. We're going to sew forward for a little bit, about an inch, and then we're going to sew backwards to create a back stitch. And then we'll sew forward again, and we're going to do the exact same thing that we did before. You may notice that I'm lining up my original stitching line with this line in the middle of the presser foot. That's to ensure that the zigzag goes over the stitching line. If it doesn't line up perfectly, that's okay. But now I'm going to sew over my strap. And then I'm going to back stitch over the entire strap again. And then we're going to sew forward all the way to the end of the bag. So we're sewing forward, lining up that stitching line as best we can with that line in the middle of the presser foot. If it's not perfect, that's okay, but we want to make sure they line up as best we can. So we're still sewing. And now I'm coming up to where my strap is. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did before, where I sew over the strap, and then I back stitch over the strap to ensure that it stays really strong. And then I sew forward one more time, all the way to the end. And then I'm gonna back stitch for about an inch. Sew forward. And now I take it out of the machine and trim off all my loose threads. In the next clip, I'm going to show you what your finished product looks like. Here is your finished product. You'll notice that you can clearly see the zigzag stitching on the bottom. All of my loose threads are trimmed off everywhere on the bag. I missed a spot there, but that's okay. Short threads like that are okay. You just want to make sure that there are no really long ones on there. So you can see my zigzag stitching. And when I open the bag, there's a clear bottom. You can't see through it. So now what I'm going to do is flip my bag right side out. So I'm just turning it inside out so that way you can see the outside of the bag. This is sort of like your great big reveal after working so hard on this bag. You're gonna need to push the corners out to make sure that they're nice and sharp. It helps if you pull on the straps a little bit. If you need to poke a pencil in there, that's totally fine, but this process is very similar to what you did with the masks. So again, we're making sure that those corners are nice and sharp. Doing the same thing on this side as well. Turning it right side out. Make sure that you can see everything. And now I'm laying it flat, making sure both my straps are on the same side. There we go. And that is our drawstring bag. You'll know that you've done it correctly when you pull your straps and they scrunch. Sometimes it's a little tight, but that's okay. It'll get easier as time goes on. And that is your drawstring bag. Thank you very much for watching. You finished the project. Yay!